before, but how would you get back here?
Some water.
Can I get you a pump?
I already got one, thank you.
It's visible? Yep.
Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Vidyam Karavavai Tejasvi Navadi Namastu Vishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us, may he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Oh, peace, peace, peace. So, good evening. So, our topic is emotions and spiritual life. So, many times people think that emotions are somehow separate from our spiritual life, that spirituality is supposed to be calm and rational and serene, and emotions, especially the messy ones, are distractions, maybe obstacles. But actually, we can use our emotions in our spiritual life. And so it's good to understand a little bit of something about our emotions so that we can use them rather than be used by them, and make sure they're not going to be obstacles to us. Because emotions are part of being human. We have our mental body and our emotional body and our physical body, in addition to our spiritual essence. And so we need to be able to use all of these. Our emotions are not something to be looked at as flaws or a sign of spiritual immaturity or something like that. So let's think about the range of emotions that we experience. We experience joy and sadness, fear, gratitude, longing. There's so many emotions, and they're not just random chemical reactions in the body. They're signals. They tell us what matters. They tell us what's important to us, what things we love, what things we should avoid, the things that we are fearing. Things that we value, things that we should be hoping for. So in spiritual life, we often talk about listening to the voice of God. Sometimes maybe God doesn't speak in words, but speaks to us by giving us a certain kind of emotional sense. So these are things that we should be tuned into. It's not, and it's not something we should be disconnected from. Now, there are many things in our scriptures that tell us about, don't be angry and so forth, try not to be sad and don't be depressed and so forth. But we can't just suppress our emotions. We have to learn how to cope with them and transmute them. So this is how we should really be dealing with them. So it's not, the real problem is not that we feel too much. The problem is that we feel without understanding. We feel without reflecting on what it is that we're feeling. We feel without real connection to them. So spiritual maturity isn't about having fewer emotions, but it's having a deeper relationship with them and understanding them. So emotions are difficult to pin down. In fact, when you look at the scientific arguments, the psychological arguments, and the philosophical arguments about emotions, you find that there's not universal agreement about all things, and that it's a bit of a messy topic. And part of that messiness is in definitions and the way we kind of loosely use emotional terms. We tend to use terms in a very casual way, and a philosopher or a psychologist or a scientist might use it in a very specific way. For example, something like love and hate. Well, we use those terms very loosely and just sort of casual conversation. You might just say, oh, I really love that movie that we just saw last night, or oh, that movie was I just hated that movie, it was horrible. You might say the same thing about food. So we use these terms that are really rather extreme terms in rather casual terms. So same thing with things like jealousy and envy. Those two terms seem very closely related, but there's sort of a technical difference. But if you look at the dictionary definition, they even kind of confuse them. But theoretically, jealousy is when you have something or had something and somebody else wants it or has gotten it from you. So it's something you've already had or you still have, and somebody else is trying to get it from you. And envy is something that you don't have, but you wish you had. So it can also mean something that's where you admire something and you wish you had it. So it can be a somewhat positive term. It can be like an aspiration, but it can also be very negative if it's kind of pushes over into jealousy, where you're so envious that it turns into spite, where if you can't have it, nobody can have it, that kind of thing. So it becomes a very negative emotion. So these things become very tricky to negotiate. So let me read some things from the scriptures from different traditions. And I'm going to focus tonight just on three main categories: anger, jealousy, and envy, just to keep it a little bit simple. We'll mention a few other emotions along the way, but we'll focus on those three just for tonight. So in the Bhagavad Gita, it describes a sage who is free from fear and anger. And so this indicates the qualities necessary for a balanced mind. So it indicates that we're going to try to not be fearful and not be angry. Well, of course, fear, if you can really tap into your true self, your Atman, there is nothing to fear, because your Atman is ever existence. The body and the mind are temporary, and any threat to the body and mind is really not a threat to the true you. So in that sense, the closer you are to that spiritual realization of your true self, the less you're going to fear. And anger usually has to do with not getting something that you want, either just in a situation, not having a situation that you want, or not having something physical that you want. And so if you feel whole and complete within yourself as the Atman, you don't desire anything. And so you're not going to be angry. So these are indications of how much you've been able to connect with your true self. And in chapter 5, verse 26, it says, "Those who are free from lust and anger attain spiritual bliss," which underscores the connection between emotional control and spiritual fulfillment. In the Bible, now, is interesting, when they describe God in the Bible and also in the Quran, God tends to be both jealous and angry. So I guess we're not supposed to take God as in the biblical sense as an exemplar of how we're supposed to manage our life. But in the Bible, it says that anger is not inherently sinful. It acknowledges that anger can be a valid response to injustice or wrongdoing. For example, Jesus displayed righteous anger when he cleared the temple in John 2, verses 13 through 18. However, it's crucial to differentiate between righteous anger and what the Bible would call sinful anger, which can be harmful to actions and thoughts. So sometimes if you're in a position where you're supposed to be giving instructions to somebody, maybe a parent to a child or a teacher to a student, and they haven't listened to the instructions, they're not following the rules, they're not following your orders, sometimes you have to display a little anger in order to get them to listen, to make sure that they know that this is serious. So sometimes that kind of anger is necessary, but it's important not to be out of control. So I had one of the department chairs at the school where I taught said, if you're really angry, don't show it. But if you're not angry and you need to show anger, then go ahead, because sometimes some of these students need to be disciplined. They need to be put in their place. But you don't want to be out of control doing it. So you make sure you're not really very angry when you do it. The Bible also says to be slow to anger. Numerous verses encourage believers to be slow to anger and to respond with patience, such as Proverbs 14, verse 29. Whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. So, again, this is it's often advised that if you're feeling angry, count to 10 so that it gives you time to think. And that really goes into giving some distance to emotions, and we're going to talk about that more later. Do not let anger lead into sin. So Ephesians 4 says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. So that shows us we're not supposed to keep our anger, and that which is really just harming us. If you just hang on to an angry thought and mull over it, and you're not being able to do anything about it, not being able to discuss it or have some sort of reconciliation or mediation, it's not doing anything but keeping negative hormones going on in your body. So, is that somebody's phone ringing?
I'm wondering what that is. Sounds like a clock.
Yeah, it does.
It's bells or something.
I hope it's not my phone. I thought I turned all my alarms off.
Okay.
Or maybe hopefully it'll shut down. If not, I'll have to run upstairs. It doesn't sound like an alarm that I have. I don't use that.
Sounds like a clock.
Yeah, it sounds like the Winchester chimes.
Yeah.
Consequences of uncontrolling anger. The Bible warns against the dangers of uncontrolled angers. Again, in Proverbs, it says, fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end. This suggests that allowing anger to dictate actions can lead to foolish decisions and conflict. Again, the Gita tells us that we lose our bearings. We don't think straight when we're angry. And so it's not a good situation to be in. And in James 1, verse 20, it reminds us that human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. The Bible also encourages us to process the emotions through prayer and reflection, seeking God's guidance on how to respond appropriately. Galatians says, put away all anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. In Buddhism, it says anger is considered one of the three poisons, alongside greed and ignorance, which are the primary causes of suffering and the cycle of rebirth. It is viewed as a negative force that can destroy the good we have cultivated. Buddhism teaches that anger cannot be resolved by anger itself. Only compassion and understanding can extinguish it. So again, if you display so much anger, it often just makes the other person more angry. So it doesn't lead to any kind of peaceful resolution. Now looking at, let's take a moment to look at the root word for jealousy. Jealousy comes from root words that have deep connections to desire and rivalry, which is what we have come to understand it. You have a rivalry with something. Jealousy has that kind of connotation. Whereas envy, it's not that both of you couldn't have it. It's just that the other person has it and you haven't gotten it. But jealousy, there's a rivalry kind of insinuation. Let's see. In Buddhism, jealousy is viewed as a form of hostility and a deep disturbance of the mind. It arises from focusing on another's accomplishments, possessions, and status, leading to feelings of resentment and attachment to worldly goods. So again, you see jealousy is getting a little bit mixed up here, because here it doesn't indicate anything about having lost something, which is usually the technical definition of jealousy. So this is probably more correctly using it a different term, but still, jealousy is considered one of the poisons again in Buddhism and can bind the individual and hinder spiritual progress, making it essential for practitioners to overcome it through various kinds of practice, such as showing sympathy and joy for someone else. And many traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism and the Bible, suggest cultivating contentment for what you have. The truly rich person is the one who is content with what they already have, because we know many rich people are not content with what they have, even though they're very wealthy, and they just want to be richer. And so they're not happy. Whereas some very simple people living out in a village in some remote area have almost no worldly possessions, but they lead very cheerful lives because they're happy with what they have. In the Bible, jealousy is described as a corrosive emotion that can destroy relationships and personal peace. In Proverbs, it says, "A tranquil heart gives life to the flesh, but envy makes the bones rot." And again, it says, "Combat jealousy with thoughts of gratitude and love." Hebrews says, "Be content with what you have," reminding us to focus on the blessings that we have rather than what other people have. And the Tao Te Ching says, "Contentment doesn't come from having treasures or the affections of others. It is found in living a life of frugality, compassion, and humility." And I saw a YouTube clip the other day about a man who made billions of dollars in his lifetime and died with nothing because he gave it all away all the time. He never amassed a fortune, not like many of these people that end up with, worth billions of dollars, and then they found a foundation and give away stuff. But they always keep their mansions. They've got 3 houses and 6 yachts and 10 cars. And okay. But this man lived in a simple apartment and drove, I think he took public transportation. I mean, he lived as simply as you possibly could and gave away all the money. In Hinduism, jealousy is viewed as a negative emotion that can lead to the destruction of personal harmony, again, and relationships. So there's a unanimous opinion among the religious traditions about things like anger and jealousy. It's considered a negative emotion and an obstacle in the path to spiritual growth and self-realization. And if you want to take the slightly similar idea of envy, the Bhagavad Gita also has several teachings against that. The detrimental nature of envy in the Bhagavad Gita emphasizes that envy is one of the more destructive emotions. It can lead to negative consequences for people that harbor it, including inner turmoil, unhappiness, and spiritual stagnation. But now, of course, many times we say these things casually about things. We might tell somebody that we're envious of them because they can stick to their diet, or we're envious of the fact that they've gotten a a promotion or something, but we're not even in that same company, so it's not like we're really envious of them. We just use that term, and again, it can be something that we're aspiring to. We hear somebody play a musical instrument well, and we wish we could play it well, but we know that it takes a lot of practice. It doesn't just happen, and so sometimes we use that term, and it's not this kind of destructive envy where we're stewing over it all day and night. But it does emphasize the importance of contentment. Of course, we all also need to be motivated in life, and sometimes when you aspire to something, it's because you saw somebody else and you admired what they did. You might say that you were envious of them, but not in a negative sense, but more in an admiring sense. Of course, in Hinduism, we promote the idea that spiritual realization is the ultimate goal. Envy and jealousy arise from the ego. They're ego problems. And so that shows that we still have a lot to overcome. If we find ourselves jealous or envious of somebody, we have to overcome these things by transcending the ego and trying to lessen our connection with our individual ego. And this can help by letting go of that envy and developing a more compassionate and understanding attitude. It helps to develop a sense of equanimity among people. It advises us to treat success and failure, gain and loss, and praise criticism with the same attitude. So this approach helps to reduce, again, that sense of personal identity and leading over into envies and jealousies. We can transform envy into empathy and compassion by practicing more compassion, being more compassionate, understanding suffering and challenges that others may face, and so forth. Looking at people that are not as well off as we are, rather than looking at the people that are better off than we are. Look at the people that are not as well off as we are, and that helps us to realize that we really have what we need, and other people are not as fortunate as we are. Well, we really didn't pin down the exact meaning of emotion. Probably should have started with that. Emotion, where does it come from? It comes from the root words that mean moving or steering or agitation. Emotions are feelings to a certain extent, but they're not exactly synonymous with feelings. So feelings and emotions are sometimes used synonymously, but again, philosophers and psychologists would make some distinctions here. But it has to come from that root word meaning to move. And so emotions are things that can motivate us and move us. So they're, in order for us to lead fulfilling lives, it's often emotional things that motivate us to do things. To get us out of tamasic states. We don't want to stay in tamas. We need a little rajas to get us motivated. You could sit around and intellectually, your mind could convince you that a particular course of action is the appropriate action. But if you're not emotionally invested in it, you're probably never going to get started. It's just, I can see that's probably the best course of action. You might analyze it as, the best place to move or the best job to take. But if in your heart you don't feel like it's the best job or the best move, you're not going to do it. So emotions are things that really do move us. And so we need to realize that emotions and the intellect are not in conflict, but they need to work in harmony together. many people think that that the intellect, the mind is rational, and our emotions are irrational. They just happen, and they don't often make sense, and we can't really depend on them. But sometimes it's very good to depend on your emotions. And just like our intellect isn't always accurate either, we could, well, just look at science. We've talked about that in the past, where many of the scientific discoveries and theories, they're not the discoveries, but the theories that we put on the discoveries seem to work for a while, but then we discover that they don't work so well. We have to come up with new theories. So our intellect is not always that accurate. Sometimes we've completely misread situations, and we come up with wrong conclusions, which can then lead us to wrong emotions as well. So our emotions too can be either right or wrong. Sometimes, for example, let's suppose that you're a little rabbit or something, and you have this inborn fear of being attacked by a flying predator like an eagle or a hawk. And so whenever there's a little shadow that flicks across the ground, you might get scared. Well, it might just be an airplane or a helicopter. And so your fear is unfounded. And so human beings do the same thing. There might be a noise somewhere and we don't know what the noise is, and we're afraid it might be a burglar or a prowler or something, but it's just a branch that fell off a tree or something of that nature. So, but if we were never afraid of anything, we wouldn't survive very well. Our fears are ingrained in us because we do need to survive. And until you're completely realized and you really don't care whether the body lives or goes, it's important to keep the body around. And so we have to listen to our emotions like fear in order to make sure that we can function in the world. We're still having to function in the world. Even realized souls, they're not in the state of samadhi all the time. And when they're living in the ordinary plane of existence, they still have to function in the real world too. And they have to listen to their emotions as well as their mind in order to do that. Now, emotions are sometimes also called passions. And this word is even stranger than the word emotions, because it has completely opposite meanings sometimes. For example, the oldest meaning seems to relate to suffering, such as the Passion of Christ. And of course, a famous musical work called like St. John's Passion, for example, that Bach wrote. So it means suffering and enduring. It has to go with somebody that's endured something difficult. But we also talk about being passionate about something we like. There's a completely different kind of meaning to the word passion. So it's interesting that these words end up with these completely opposite kinds of meanings, because we might say somebody is just passionate about their new job, or they're passionate about music, or they're passionate about gardening. It has nothing to do with being suffering or enduring. So somehow that word is even more complex than the word emotion itself. So emotion, feeling, and so forth, all of these words are sometimes used synonymously, but they're tricky definitions. Now, if a neuroscientist looks at emotions, they try to pin it all down to neurochemicals, your hormones and things, and your neurotransmitters that are aroused in the parts of the brain that are activated during certain kinds of emotional states. So they might find that, for example, in fear, there's an activation of the amygdala, and that kind of thing. And there's an increase in certain hormones, in some of the cortical hormones. But we have many more nuanced emotions than could be described by the limited number of uh, hormones and neurotransmitters that we have. And so that's a very limited approach to it. We're not really sure where emotions are. They seem to be everywhere in the body. In fact, we have a lot of phrases that indicate that that different emotions are in different parts of our body, like you feel something in your gut, or you have an uneasy feeling in your stomach, or you feel heart wrenched, or something of that nature. So emotions seem to be felt throughout the entire body, whereas our mental activity we tend to think of as happening in our head, but our emotions seem to happen all over the body. They're happening in the head, and the heart, and the stomach, and all over. So it's interesting that there's no easy way to pin down where our emotions are. But there are some key structures involved. As we mentioned, the amygdala is crucial for processing certain kinds of emotions, such as fear and anger. When a threat is perceived, the amygdala triggers an alarm and activates the stress response in the body. The prefrontal cortex is a region responsible for rational thinking and decision making, and also impulse control. So during anger, its activity decreases, which can lead to impulsive and irrational behavior as the emotional response takes precedence over the logical reasoning. Now, we know some people that seem to have some sort of inborn imbalance, and they have to have anger management training because they've just got such a short fuse that they haven't learned to control their anger. It really overrides that prefrontal cortex so much that they can't control it, and then it becomes socially very unacceptable, and they find that they're not able to really be in good relationships with very many people for a very long time if they're constantly getting angry like this. And they can end up being violent when the situation just doesn't call for it. So it is possible for us to learn to control our emotions, because we can get specialized training if necessary in order to do that. Now, let's see. I want to talk a little bit about our spiritual practice too, more specifically. Let's go back to these notes. One thing is to remember that emotions can be our teachers in many things. Joy teaches us what gives life meaning. Sadness teaches what we've loved and lost. Anger teaches us where our boundaries are. Fear teaches us what we need to protect ourselves against. Compassion teaches us how to connect with others. And gratitude teaches us to see the gifts that we often overlook. And in spiritual life requires honesty. And so we want to be honest about our emotions. We don't want to just pretend like they're not there. So we want to be honest and recognize what it is that we're feeling. So when you feel something, the first thing is to recognize it honestly, and then you can start to analyze it, and that tends to help you get a little bit of distance from it so that you're not feeling it so strongly. You, like the Jnani develops that witness consciousness, you want to develop your witness consciousness with respect to your emotional state. So you first give it a name. If you name it, then that helps to give you a little bit of distance, first of all. And then you can say, well, let's see, what is it that caused this angry situation? And so you use your mind to sort of get that distance of the observer. You're now observing this situation, and you're trying to analyze it and thinking, well, how could it be better? How could I have avoided it? How can I correct it? And so forth. And also, it's very difficult to meditate when you're angry. That's why the Gita suggests not getting angry, because it affects your spiritual practices. So prayer is often the answer. Prayer is easier to do than meditation. So you can pray and reflect on your particular emotional state, whatever it is. And usually, most emotions are object oriented. They're something about something in the world. But there are, of course, cases of like free floating anxiety where the person really doesn't have a clue as to why they're feeling anxious. They just feel anxious all the time. And so that's most likely some sort of chemical imbalance that's being caused there, or some deep-seated psychological problem that's not apparent, or something that's come from a past life. It could have been something ingrained in us. And of course, the way we're raised has something to do with it. For example, if a little kid starts to throw a lot of temper tantrums, the way the parent reacts is going to train the kid is that either temper tantrums don't work or get you what you want. And so a person that's raised one way or the other is going to develop those habits. Emotions can be strategies for us dealing with the world. They're not just things that happen to us. That's another misconception about emotions. People think that, well, emotions just happen to you. I just got angry. Well, they're reactions, and they're ways of coping with the world. And good negotiators and ambassadors and so forth, they know how not to respond with anger, because they know that's not a very good strategy for negotiations. And if you want to solve the problem, you need to have a better strategy. So thinking in that way, it helps you to prevent getting angry in the first place. So a deep spiritual life is being present fully in the moment. But emotions often pull us out of the present. Fear drags us into the future, regret drags us into the past, anxiety scatters us in all directions, anger tightens us. It's interesting, the root word for anger also means to be restricted. So that's an interesting metaphor. So in spiritual life, we should try to calm ourselves down, pause, breathe, and return to the present moment. In the present moment, is there really anything to fear? Is there anything to be angry about? Just right now, not thinking about the past or the future. So if we can really be present to the now, a lot of these emotions can be settled down. Once those emotions get kicked up, there are those chemicals running through your body, and it takes a little bit of work to get them to transmute out. It's not instantaneous, so you have to be a little patient with yourself. But when we're present, emotions tend to lose their power to control us, and that's the thing. We want to be in control of our emotions because we want to use emotions for ourselves and not be used by them. So they might still be speaking, but they're not going to speak as loudly. They can become part of the conversation rather than the whole conversation. Spiritual traditions across the world speak of transformation as becoming more whole, more loving, and more awake. So those emotions are emotions that we need to try to cultivate. A transformation rarely happens in a moment of comfort. It happens when things stir us up. And what did we say about emotions? Emotions are things that stir us up. And so when we're moved, challenged, or broken, or inspired, emotions are often the catalyst for our spiritual growth. So when we feel particular emotion, we can use that as a clue. All right, I need to work more on my spiritual growth. Vivekananda used to say that he learned more from his difficult times than from his good times. And so when we have negative emotions, we need to use that as a time to learn. We can also learn the spiritual skill of holding our emotions with compassion and not necessarily judging them or feeling ashamed of them or pushing them away or pretending they're not there. Just as we do that with individuals, we want to learn how to treat all individuals with compassion. We need to treat ourselves with compassion, and especially our emotional reactions. So it's okay to feel this particular way, but I'm not going to stay feeling this way. I'm going to learn how to transmute these feelings and use these feelings for a higher purpose. So if we treat it with compassion, we can learn, that will help us to learn to treat other people with compassion, because other people are going to be going through their emotional states, and we have to sometimes deal with that. And so sometimes we need to learn how to relate to other people in the world and in our community. So once you've named an emotion, you can think, well, what is this emotion trying to tell me? What need or value or wound is underneath it? Can I bring it into prayer or reflection? Can I make it part of my spiritual practice, or is there a part of my spiritual practice I need to strengthen? Sometimes it's helpful to share with somebody if you can find a compassionate friend that you can share and help to heal emotions. But you can always speak to yourself the way you would speak to someone else if you found someone that you were fond of and you wanted to help them out of an emotional crisis. Think of how you would speak to them and speak to yourself the same way. And remember that every joy is an invitation to gratitude, and every sorrow is an invitation to healing. Every fear is an invitation to trust. Every anger is an invitation to justice. Every longing is an invitation to a deeper connection. Now, where did I put my yogas? All right, here we go. All right, from the more Vedantic perspective, we can remember that emotions are like clouds in the sky. They come and they go, they shift, they dissolve, but the sky, that witness consciousness, remains untouched. Another way to look at it is that we're the deep ocean of Satchidananda, and the emotions are just the little ripples and waves on the surface. And we don't need to focus just on the waves on the surface, because we're that whole ocean. We're as deep as the ocean, and we can focus on any part of it. Why not focus on the deepest, stillest part of the ocean? And again, we don't need to feel our emotions are bad. We don't need to suppress them. We simply need to know that they are not the essence of who we are. If we forget this, then the emotions tend to overwhelm us and start to control us. And we feel that we are this emotion. We are sad, or we are angry, or we are passionately in love and it's being thwarted, or whatever. So we need to remember that they're not the essence of who we are. So both our minds and our emotions are really the instruments for our spiritual path. We also need to recognize that our emotions might indicate deep-seated impressions in our soul from earlier parts of our life or from past lives. And so these emotional reactions may be tendencies that we have developed over lifetimes. And so we need to look at these emotions as messages as to what it is we need to work on. So when fear arises, it's not a weakness, it's a pointer. When longing arises, it's not a distraction, it's a signpost that we need to look at. So each emotion reveals a deep-seated vasana, we could use that term, that is to be uncovered, seen, understood, and eventually released. Now, in the Bhakti tradition, we don't suppress emotions, we transform them. Fear becomes surrendering to the Lord. If you've done everything you can to avoid a difficult situation, then you have to just surrender to whatever the situation is and feel that the Lord is there behind you and giving you whatever it is that you need to live through. Longing needs to be transformed into longing for the divine, love for the divine. Grief and sadness needs to become yearning for the divine and communion with your beloved chosen ideal. And joy in spiritual practice needs to be recognized as gratitude for the grace that we have received from the divine. In karma yoga, this is one of the key ways of preventing things like anger and jealousy and envy by detachment. So once we've done our work and we detach from the results, then we don't need to get angry if somebody didn't like what we did. We don't need to be envious if somebody was able to do it better. We've detached from our work. We did the best we could, and now we've detached from it. So the fear of failure or the desire for recognition, gee, why didn't everybody notice that I did such a great job? Those kinds of thoughts just shouldn't be there when we're practicing karma yoga. And if they arise, then you just remind yourself, okay, karma yoga teaches me I should detach from those kinds of thoughts, and then you can let them go. So if we can act with sincerity and not without clinging to the outcomes, the mind becomes lighter and the emotional reactions become softer, and you become more spontaneous from the heart. So karma yoga again doesn't eliminate our emotions, but it purifies them and allows them sort of to dissolve away. And we already mentioned really jnana yoga. Jnana yoga is that emphasis on the witness consciousness in everything. Now, we all know that our minds and our whole lives are made up of three gunas: tamas, that kind of inertia, that dullness that doesn't want to get started, and rajas, that restlessness and energetic aspect, and sattva, that clear, calm clarity. Well, we want to stay in that sattvic clarity as much as possible. And that's again why the Gita recommends not getting angry, because that clouds your clarity. So emotions colored by tamas are things like depression and apathy and confusion and not really being able to get started. Cultivated by rajas, we might feel angry or anxious or jealous, craving for things. And emotions colored by sattva give us a feeling of peacefulness and tranquility, compassion, joy, and pleasure. And so we want to try to emphasize the sattvic nature of things rather than the other two. Of course, if you're in tamas, then you need some rajas to get out of it. But eventually we want to get towards that sattvic clarity. And again, if an emotion that's too rajasic keeps coming in, you have to remember, all right, I don't want to be quite so agitated here because it's going to cloud my clarity. I'm not going to be able to think as clearly as I need to if I'm constantly in this agitated state. And a lot of times we hang on to these emotions way beyond the time when the situation has occurred. And it's, I've noticed this in some devotees that they're very good at just letting go. If they've had an argument with you yesterday, today you would never know it. They don't act like they've had an argument with you. They just act as they always have. And that's a very good trait that we should all try to cultivate. So how do we cultivate our sattvic aspects? Well, we need to keep up our meditation practice. We need to do selfless service when we can. Eat good food and be in good spiritual company helps us to keep uplifted. Study scriptures and just generally ethical living. All of these things contribute to that sattvic mind state. Other things you can do is you can offer your emotional state. That's a good bhakti yoga practice. It just feel like you can take your emotional state that you don't want and offer it. Please take this. So there's nothing too small or too messy to offer in bhakti yoga. So, all right. So again, emotions are in general kind of a messy topic because the definitions are messy. We use terms casually where the people that you might read about them in our scriptures and so forth might be using them in a much more strict sense. And so it's often difficult to make sure we're understanding everything. But our emotions are a natural part of our life. We need to more our spiritual growth through the practice of it. And again, our spiritual teachers tell us how difficult it is to meditate when you're aroused by any kind of emotion, really. So you need to try to soften those emotions down and calm them and realize that you don't want to just live on the surface of the ocean. You want to dive down deep. All right, so we'll close with a chant, and if you'd like to offer flowers, continue. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om peace, peace, peace. Take lots, take 2 or 3.
Okay, I'll pass it along.
Do I have to stop something? And goodbye.